Welcome. This webinar is called From Visio to Process Simulation with BPMN. Our expert trainer is JD Baker. I'm your moderator, Loriana Zanotti. I work with EA Principles as the program director. So this webinar is sponsored by EA Principles Incorporated and is the second in a series that will provide insight into how to create business-focused models. EA Principles is a global leader in enterprise architecture training and consulting. We are also a gold member of the Open Group and one of only 4 Archimate certification sponsors in the Open Group. We had one of the earliest accredited enterprise architecture programs, and we were the first American company to provide Archimate training and coaching in the US. Our experts in enterprise architecture have helped author several key documents and have an average of 15+ years of training and experience. And now I'll move on to introduce JD Baker. So JD, you can, okay, that slide works. JD Baker has a rich background of experience, including being a software systems engineer with enterprise architecture, requirements development, software system architecture, and system design processes and methodologies that support model-based engineering. He is a consultant for model-based analysis and development, using Sparx Systems Enterprise Architect. JD is also a board member representing Sparx Systems for the Object Management Group, also known as OMG. So before we begin, please make sure that your microphones are muted. Please only unmute your microphone if JD has opened up the floor to questions or feedback and you'd like to participate. There will also be a time for questions and answers at the end with JD. This webinar is currently being recorded. So thank you very much for attending, and JD, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Loriana. So we have 3 primary objectives today. The first of those is to consider the issues that we face when creating any kind of models, but specifically business processes, using a drawing tool instead of a modeling tool. We will look at the steps that we take to improve the development of those processes in transitioning from that drawing tool to a modeling tool. And even more importantly, moving into a standardized notation or language. And then we'll finish with a look at the capabilities, the standards-based capabilities that exist for simulating those business processes and executing them for verification and validation purposes or analysis purposes to ensure that we understand what those processes are actually all about. So the things that we're talking about today include BPMN. BPMN is the specification formerly known as Business Process Model and Notation, and it's a product of the OM Group, OMG, and the URL for the current version is available there. That specification is freely available and downloadable. In addition to the specification, there is a separate working group that is working on model interchange. And one of the advantages of BPMN is that there are a fairly significant number of vendors who do BPMN models. And at least 11 of us have participated in interchange demonstrations, live demonstrations that were directly recorded, and that raw recording is available to you at the YouTube site that you see here. You don't have to copy these URLs. The slides will be available at some point in time in a PDF format, so that you can have the URLs available to you. But if you Google, BPMN interchange demo, you'll find a couple of different YouTube videos. The third thing is not a product of the OMG. It is a product of the Workflow Management Coalition. And some of the people at the OMG in the business modeling task force also participate in the WFMC, and they have created a product called BPSim, which is a simulation standard for BPMN. So those are the products and the kinds of things that we're going to explore today. All right. So a little bit of what I think is the difference between models and diagrams. Models have 5 basic characteristics, and those characteristics should be true about all models, and all models should be um, should have those same 5 characteristics. In other words, they're abstract. And that abstraction means that only the important stuff is being considered, or only the relevant elements are a part of the model. They are understandable, right? Expressed in a form that is readily understood by observers translates to me to be something that is a standard language, a language in which there's a specification, a language in which there are books and other tools that allow us to read and produce the various kinds of models. They ought to be accurate. We ought not to be able to do things that that the system's not going to be able to do just because we're working in software. They ought to be predictive. Right? That is they ought to be able to draw conclusions about the system from the model. Right? And that's going to be an important aspect of what we do with BPSim. And finally, they should be traceable. And that is that the elements, where necessary, ought to be linked in some way. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that is true in BPMN and other model elements. While it's true that diagrams could be expressive and even accurate, but they don't have very much of an ability to be predictive. Traceability is dependent upon the modeler and third-party or other tools. So if you do a traceability matrix for a business process to a requirement, it usually winds up being in some form of a Word document table or something like that. So it's spread across different file formats, different diagrams, etc. And most of these files are not meant to be shared. And one of the advantages, as you'll see, is that if you use a modeling tool like Enterprise Architect that allows you to share the model amongst team members, you improve your business process development. So this presentation is based on a case study that actually brings together 2 different separate engagements. Primarily, we worked with a government department that have 5 business analysts. Their role was to provide low-income households with home energy solutions, and secondarily dealing with the notion of lead and lead hazards. The secondary organization was another state organization in a different state that had a larger group of BAs and was in the healthcare field. And so this presentation kind of combines the engagements that we went through in those two with those 2 organizations. So the business analyst team in the primary organization, as I said, was 5 people, and yes, the names have been changed. We start with Betty, who on the first day that when we were introducing ourselves, explained that she had 19 years of experience with the organization and was contemplating retirement. There was Bill, who had a decent amount of experience with the organization, and everybody else was less than a year. And as you might imagine, they leaned on Betty a lot for her domain expertise. We were there because they had a changing business need that drove some change in business processes, and they were struggling a little bit to get those developed and validated and verified using Visio. And in some cases, there were people who had left the organization, replaced by Bob, Brian, and Brenda, who had started to work on those, and there were questions about what was going on. So with their limited domain knowledge, they needed to develop these new processes and selected Enterprise Architect as their modeling tool. that would work through their process for providing um, both the visualization of those business processes, eventually doing some automated evaluation. So the Visio came in three different forms. So most of us have some form of Visio in this in our businesses, et cetera. It is a tool that many people are familiar with and are 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 using to create processes or diagrams of other kinds. Just last night, I had a person who was attending the same conference I am tell me that if he had his wish, he would buy Visio from Microsoft and then put it on a shelf and never sell it again. So there are people who aren't really thrilled with it, and then others who think it's a perfectly fine tool. So we had three different unique representations. The first of those was diagrams that were drawn using BPMN notation with the BPMN stencil in Visio. The second of those were diagrams that were drawn with a variety of different business process notations. It was a different business process stencil that had different notations and elements. And then finally, there were diagrams with whatever the diagrammer felt was interesting to put on a diagram. There were business processes and a variety of other diagram elements. I'll show you a representation of each of those. The bottom line is that each of those different unique representations required a different approach to incorporate them into the enterprise architect model. So the first of those was, okay, this pretty straightforward. All of these are standard BPMN elements. There's tasks and gateways and and data objects, start and end events, etc. Pools and lanes, and this was some of the business process models that were in existence that we had to deal with. The second of these was a drawing with other notation. So what were the boxes and lines and the gateways were kind of interesting because they all had text in part of them. Notice that we've got a kind of a curious mix of vertical and horizontal pools and lanes. And a home plate thing that in flowchart notation is an off-page connector. So how do I deal with that? Where is that off-page? That second page, if you will, and then some other information available on the lines themselves, and then third. I hit the key, so we'll just move to this next one, was just a variety of notations and other kinds of things. The column on the left, I'll highlight and say that that's a bunch of risks. And so risks have been identified, and they're being managed by attaching them to various process elements. And as you can see, there's a fairly complex legend, and just a variety of notational kinds of things and stacked up kinds of things. And it's even difficult in some cases to tell exactly which element was being attached, or what third other elements, triangles and squares and what have you, were actually being attached to which business process elements, etc. And trying to follow the process flow through this was somewhat challenging. So take those three different representations, and the first thing we need to do is to import the Visio diagrams into Enterprise Architect, and then compare the existing Visio diagrams with the model diagrams, talk about how we were going to do, some sort of automated review, look for opportunities to automate changes and automate some of the import stuff, and realize that sometimes the only way we're going to be able to do the import is to just recreate the diagram in the modeling tool and just start over and start from scratch. So the step was a direct import, and the direct imports take that 2B vendor management process that we were looking at, import it. We got the pools and the lanes and the processes and the gateways and the events. All of that stuff started. We had a little, we got some issues with the size of the font, perhaps, or something like that, but easily correctable. And our data objects came out looking like an event, and that was easily corrected. And so all of the work that was invested in, and you can see the tabs across the top of the diagram here, the various diagrams that are included here. All of those were imported because they conformed to the BPMN specification. Enterprise Architect has the capability to import the various kinds of BPMN diagrams. It can import Visio in whatever. If it understands it as UML or BPMN, then it can convert those and do that kind of work. And so this was simply, a simple unmodified import with a little bit of cleanup at the end for each of these diagrams. But it was pretty straightforward as far as doing the direct import. Now, I want to call your attention to, in Enterprise Architect, went the wrong way. In Enterprise Architect, up in the top right-hand corner here of the slide, you'll notice that we have the BPMN2 toolbox is what's being presented. Enterprise Architect relates the toolbox elements with the type of diagram. So this is a BPMN diagram, so I get a BPMN toolbox. The next step is when we imported the other notation, that stuff that had things going in two different directions and different kinds of issues. Notice that it was attempting to interpret it in some non-standard way, and so the toolbox, the diagram was not a BPMN diagram. It was something that what came from another profile, another MDG technology, and it was an analysis diagram. Now, and so the toolbox was not the BPMN toolbox. Now, the good news is that it still did a faithful representation of the import, right? And that is that whenever there was a rounded rectangle for a task, it provided a rounded rectangle for a task, and it did these little ovals for starts and other kinds of things. But it was consistent in the way that it imported that second unique representation. What that afforded us is, once we realized that they were all coming in basically the same, was the opportunity to convert those diagrams and to convert the imported Visio diagram to BPMN. And so we created a script that went through and converted the diagrams to BPMN and the elements to BPMN elements. And we were able to do that in an automated fashion. And so once again, a significant amount of time saved in directly importing the diagrams and then using the scripting capabilities within EA in order to be able to convert those diagrams to the appropriate notation. And because the stencil had been used in Visio, at least we were able to consistently change things and do things, a set of automations. So we have the first two sets of things transformed into appropriate and applicable BPMN models rather than diagrams. So you look at the other notation, with all the other elements, the risks, and all that other kind of good stuff, we were, let's see what happens. Imported one of them, and there really was way too much junk on those. The automated import, the direct importer, had no chance of actually being able to cleanly import those. What's more, there were too many different things and too many different ways and too many non-standard notations to actually do an automatic evaluation. So there was no script that we could write that would do that. In addition to the fact that there was so much more besides the business process on that diagram, there were just too many things to want to be able to create. So it was a simple process of put the modeling tool on one screen, put Enterprise Architect on another screen, and recreate the process model. Process, while we were at it, we captured all of the other types of elements on those in that notation as well. Captured in EA, and then traced to the process elements. We can have separate traceability representations and not clutter up the business process with the other elements, but still be able to, in terms of what their relationships might be. And so we did. There is a set of tools that are freely available that allow us to evaluate what this basically means. Is once we had all of our diagrams converted from whatever notation they were, in whatever way we did the conversion, either through a direct import and clean up, direct import and run a script, or recreate by hand, we were then able to run the BPMN rules against all of those diagrams. One of the things that's true about BPMN is the diagrams are normative. That's not true with some of the other modeling languages from the OMG, such as UML. If you have the latest version, that some sort of diagram interchange representation was a part of the specification. In BPMN, the diagrams and the notation are part of the normative specification, and so we're able to validate what things look like. We're able to validate what relationships exist that are not legal. For example, lanes and pools improperly situated, and other types of violations of the BPMN specification itself. Now, we can't evaluate the quality of your business process, okay, but we can evaluate the quality of your business process diagram. We still have a ways to go before we can can actually of, is your business process going to solve your business problem? But we'll get there here in about 5 minutes. Um, so this set of tools validates your model against the specification. Once you know that you've got it a valid model against the specification, then we know we can then begin the analysis to verify and validate this as being something that will solve the user's problem. So I mentioned that we can capture other kinds of things, okay? The model can contain many other types of elements, okay? Enterprise Architect has the ability to do a wide variety of model notations and model elements and other kinds of things that are whatever you need it to be. In this case, I'm showing you the toolbox that has, test cases and issues and requirements and other kinds of things on it. But there are a number of things that we can do. So we went through those cluttered diagrams, the third set, and captured all of the things that were in those diagrams as well as go looking in other kinds of documents, concept documents, marketing documents, whatever was available for us to be able to capture that. You see in the pane down below, there's a document pane. I can capture document text and keep it as a part of the model. And we can create different kinds of business process, business context, requirements view, organizations in our models, and then relate them to the processes in our Visio import model. So here's just some of the things that we can do. Right? We have, a business process about modifying an agreement, right? And then we're traced to 3 different process risks. Now, that presentation could be on a diagram. It would typically be on a diagram that did not include all of the other process models. So I'd put the various process tasks on a diagram and then relate them to the risks if I needed to visualize that. If I didn't need to visualize it, and instead I wanted to just create a table of those kinds of things, I could do that with the relationship matrix. So you see here, and just a quick note about the relationship matrix, is I relate anything to anything else. All right. So I've got tests being related to process risks. I have activities. The collection of things called test, what types, activities, and risks. I can choose what kind of linkage that I'm interested in. So I can have multiple kindships between things and choose which ones to view. Choose directionality. Your choices are source to target, target to source, or both. So you can see any of the relationships any of the trace relationships that exist between things, and then I can save that. So this risk to task is the name of a relationship matrix that's being stored in EA. And every time I open the relationship matrix, it refreshes itself and gets me, the common set of data out of Enterprise Architect. So in this way, I can make sure that nothing's lost. I can look along here and say, well, I've got, relationships being traced to risks, but nothing about, security collaboration. Is there really no risk in collaborate with security? I'm not sure. Perhaps I need to do some further analysis. But the presentation will allow me to do that. I can do other things in the tool. So, for example, once I've got these relationships, if I put the 2 things on the same diagram, the relationships will automatically appear. I can remove them from a diagram without removing them from the model. Or I can put an element like the modify agreement task onto a diagram and ask it what it's related to, and ask it to insert everything that it's related to onto the diagram, no matter where it is in your model organization. So we have a lot of flexibility and a lot of possibilities with being able to model that we can't necessarily do with a diagram. So the end result of this, the first stage of this effort, the first process, was that the models became more consistent across all of the team members. And that's because they were using, the same language. They were using the same approach. Their modeling process was one that we developed as a part of the training, and of course that both the training in Enterprise Architect and the training in the language were a significant factor in what we were able to accomplish. Process models were accurate. Process models were precise, where precision was appropriate. There were a number of places where process and task reuse became apparent, and so we explored some of those opportunities. And the whole process of working in a modeling environment rather than in separate document files kind of encouraged or supported better team dynamics. So the team became closer in work, even though they were separate in their various locations, the same as they had always been, but they were all working in the same model instead of working in a network file share or a SharePoint repository with a bunch of different files and drawings and what have you. So next comes the introduction of BPSim and the notion of, well, now that we have a set of processes that are accurate and we think precise, now that we have a set of processes that are based on a standard modeling language, and now that we have a set of processes that have been validated against the specification, perhaps we should work on validating them against the business need. And the way to do that is through execution, and in Enterprise Architect, that allows they introduced the notion of BPSim and an implementation of the standard from the WFMC, and so we began to create simulations for key business processes. Now, one of the intents was to offer those BPSim results and the reports and the graphs and stuff that we generate from that to demonstrate various kinds of regulatory compliance. And that was that was done at the end of our engagement, and apparently went fairly well. I wasn't involved in that the last part of that step. So BPSim talks about perspectives, and there are multiple perspectives: control, time, and resource. And the way Enterprise Architect deals with those is they can develop each of those perspectives independently, or you can do them together. And so we'll look at the control, time, and resource perspectives for an example simulation process. It is not one that that one of the case study companies developed, because I don't have permission to share that with outside of those organizations. One of the interesting things about the way Enterprise Architect has implemented the BPSim configuration is that you can maintain multiple versions of a configuration. And so we'll look at one where we did exactly that, where we created multiple versions and then ran the simulation for those configurations. Um, the the most satisfying thing for me is now I can save those configurations independently, and I can save the results independently. So I can use them in various kinds of reports or go back and look at them again, etc. So what does that mean? Right? So what are those perspectives means from a simulation perspective? So control talks about how the activity flows through the process. So there's a way to specify the likelihood of a sequence of events and the priorities of certain events. And so there are a number of BPSim attributes that we need to set for that process flow. The time perspective is fairly straightforward. What is the duration of one of the activities or one of the phases of the process, or et cetera, and how much time do we allocate to the various things? And then finally, the resource perspective says uh, what kind of roles or workers or other kinds of resources are required, how many of them are required. We'll look at one where we'll look at resource variation and see how that changes our processes. Given the same number of inputs, and then you could go back and change the number of inputs and see how they're how that affects your overall process as well. So here is a picture of the time process. Now the business process says task 10 minutes. All right, but that's a name. That's a string value of some kind of characters, and um, we think what it's trying to say is that it's a task that takes 10 minutes, but we don't really know. When we go into the list of activities and notice that when I go to do a BPSim setup, it knows about all of the activities that are a part of that business process. And I can then take and set the time, uh, processing time, or other kinds of parameters. So notice that I've got a list of available parameters down here below, and I can each one of those kinds of parameters to my various times. So I can have queue times and wait times and processing time, etc. We're going to do something, fairly straightforward here, where we just have processing time, but you could have things that were very much representative of real-world business processes set up from a timing perspective. Once you create the tool, okay, and say, well, I've got business process controls being set up on things. So here's I'm in the control tab of this task 2, and notice that it doesn't have to be a constant set of controls. There are a whole number of distributions that are here. So for those of you that have experienced queuing theory or something like that, the distributions are available there, and you can set those up for whatever units you want, whatever types of inputs that you need. And so we can be very real world. This is very much of a simulation, not just an execution of the diagram, but a simulation of the business process itself. Once I create the the configuration, then I can go ahead and save that as part of the model. Got a package that includes a business process with its associated diagram, and I've got a couple of different results. So I've got a simulation, and I've got a report. Okay, and I could have multiple configurations, and each time I ran that, I would get my own report results. So now, once you create the configuration and you create the report, then everybody else has access to them. They can view that information all as a part of the model, and they can look in relationship to the business process diagram and the business process model. Go check on what risks are being addressed, or other kinds of issues or concerns or potential problems might also be necessary to consider, and we can create these configuration for each one of these situations, whatever they happen to be. So here's a report, a slightly different business process, and the activity of this report is to service a customer. Okay, and so the report for shows two different configurations. The first configuration is 5 support desk operators, and the second configuration is 3 support desk operators. And so where you see red, that's where there's different times associated with that activity, given those 2 different resource allocations. Right? So average waiting time for a resource when I've got 5 people is 0. Average time wait for 3 is 11.4. Is that acceptable? Do I really need to have 5 people when to provide 0 waiting time, or is this is this what I need for my platinum service? So if you're paying extra, I'm gonna pay extra for people. But if you're not paying extra, if you're a gold service person, then perhaps you're in the 3 queue, and that's where you're at. We can filter this. The report can be filtered so that only the things that have differences are displayed. So anytime you create a report, and this is a screenshot of the report presentation in the modeling tool itself. And anytime I do that, I can filter this so that that only the things that are different or have differences will actually be displayed. I can also create graphs, and so here are 3 different representations of the customer average time waiting, and there are what's the average time when I've got 2 people on support, what's the average time when there are 3, and what's the average time when there's 5. Right? So perhaps 2 is not adequate for my services, but anything below 15 is good. So 3 works for me. From this assuming I've got all of the other variables set correctly. So finally, and I will open it up to questions at this point in time. The one thing that I do want to point out is that in order to do the BPSim execution, you need the execution environment, and that is a separate product from Enterprise Architect. And so, it's available from Sparx. Sparx has teamed up with Lanner to to incorporate their BPSim execution engine and provide you with the ability to not only validate against the specification, but to verify that it meets your business needs, and to be able to demonstrate to anybody else that you've done some analysis and you have that you have some confidence that they are going to that the business process, if we implement that business process, it's going to meet our needs.
So at this time, does anybody have any? Oh, I think there's an echo. I just surprised myself there. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, you can unmute your microphone, or you can feel free to write the question in the message area, the chat area here. And I'll give it another minute, JD, to see if anybody chimes
Okay.
in.
All right. So looks like you've already done the conversion to PDF.
Yeah, some people had viewing trouble, so I did that here. Yeah.
Okay.
So it looks like a few people are leaving. We've got about 17 people left. So if there are no more questions, JD, thank you so much for providing this presentation. Was there anything else you wanted to conclude with?
Just one thing, and that is that it is my opinion that it's very important to model instead of draw pictures. And so, for those of you that are using Visio, Enterprise Architect is a very affordable modeling tool, and all of the things that I showed you today can be accomplished with the corporate edition of Enterprise Architect, along with the BPSim tool. So it's important for us, as the world gets more complex, systems get more distributed, that we do as much modeling work as we can in order to ensure that we are meeting our customer needs.
Troy, did you have a question?
I did. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
I was just curious about backward compatibility with Visio and whether you would recommend using Visio as a complement to Enterprise Architect for some of the other drawing features and entities and properties that Visio has, or do you typically encourage people to go all in and leverage the single vendor approach for all the bells and whistles that Enterprise Architect has?
Most of the time, it is the latter. Okay. And like everything else, there are bound to be those situations where it will be useful to do something in parallel in Visio. But the inability to share, if you will, other than through, when I'm working on something, you can't, and et cetera. The fact of the matter is I can do just about anything in EA that you can do in Visio from a modeling perspective. Now, there are other things that you can do in Visio, like you say, for purely diagramming perspective kinds of things that may well be useful. But my initial inclination is if there isn't any compelling reason to use Visio, don't do it.
And then my other question was, is BPSim a complementary product or add-on, or is it a totally different product? I mean, is it required to have Enterprise Architect for it to work?
No, although obviously our implementation of BPSim would require Enterprise Architect. But there are other tools that provide those kinds of simulations, and actually, one of the advantages of using a standard simulation environment like BPSim is the simulations themselves can be saved and run in other execution environments. But the one that you buy from Sparx works with Enterprise Architect. But there are other implementations of the simulation engine.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your presentation today. Very clear and concise.
All right. Thanks for attending.
Have a great day.
Any other questions before we leave? Check chat quickly.
Are you going to email the PDF?
So what's going to happen is I'm going to send a link to the recording of the webinar as well as to the PDF.
Okay, good.
So that will be uploaded on the EA Principles website. Yeah, sure. You're welcome.
How long will the recording on Blue Jeans be available?
Indefinitely.
Okay.
So we have a video page on the EA Principles website. So you can even see the previous webinar if you missed that one, the first one in this series.
Okay. And I'm sorry, one more question for the presenter. You mentioned the very beginning of the presentation, but I was just getting my headset on about, I think you said demos on YouTube. Was that correct? Is that what those URLs were on the first couple of pages?
So we did a BPMN interoperability demo. And so what we did was 11 vendors with 13 different tools or some ridiculous numbers like that. And then each vendor had a task. We put together part of a business process model, and then exported that using the BPMN export format. And then another tool would import it. And in some cases, depending on where you were in the chain, you imported 2 files and put them together. And or in some cases, some of the vendors changed some of the underlying attributes. So there's a number of things in BPMN that are attributes of the elements themselves, but aren't necessarily visible in the diagram, and prove that they were consistent across the various exports and imports. And so there's the URL is in the slide, but if you want to look at that at an earlier date, a simple YouTube search of BPMN model interchange should get you those videos, and they were recorded live and remain up there unedited. So,
okay, thank you.
So nobody doing anything behind the scenes.
You're talking about it from an advantage or a competitive advantage standpoint.
Well, or we're not trying to fool anybody. Okay. It really does work. All of the tools really do implement the exchange standard the way it's supposed to be implemented. We all can do, our tools, our representations, our notation looks like everybody else's, et cetera. So,
who do you typically go up against as far as competition, or at least, who's the next competitor that you're concerned with?
Well, it's kind of interesting. We are, as far as I know, the only UML modeling tool that has an implementation of the BPMN spec. We're certainly the only ones that participated in the model interchange demo. Everybody else is kind of a unique single-purpose kind of modeling tools. They all do BPMN, but that's about all they do. And so there are several, and I'm gonna miss some of them, but Signavio is one, Camunda is one, and Trisotech is another. And so it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you need to do the simulation, if you need to do the other kinds of stuff, as well as incorporate other kinds of model elements. that are not specifically BPMN, but are the risks and the issues and the or the concept models or whatever they happen to be, then we don't have any competition in that arena.
Interesting. Yeah, I spent a good year doing some process re-engineering with IBM, and we had some highfalutin consultants come in with Eris. So I spent time with them in Europe and started to get deep into the whole BPA product they have, and it's very impressive. It was nice to see process done well, from a Six Sigma standpoint and some of the other standards. But I can see what you're doing here. You're trying to create the standard within this, embracing this notation, so that folks don't go off and do their own proprietary version of things.
Correct.
It makes it hard, especially in a cloud environment where a lot of vendors are joining consortiums of other vendors, even competitors, and in leveraging a lot of the cloud tools that are being created, and the whole,
Yep.
If you're trying to be unique is not the best thing anymore. Everything's open this and open that.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate your candor.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, it's just about, I believe, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thanks for everybody who attended. I know a lot of people had to leave at the end, but that's totally fine. So I just posted this, like it was mentioned earlier, there will be a link that I'll be emailing people that has a link to this webinar and the related PDF version of the slides. So look out for an email from Loriana at eaprinciples.com. And I think that's pretty much it on my part. We don't currently have any specific BPM related courses in our schedule, but you can always schedule private training with JD. So you can also email me about that too. But thanks again for attending, and have a great afternoon and evening to people.
All right. Good afternoon, Loriana.
Okay. Thanks, JD. Bye.